This video is sponsored by ExpressVPN. If you want to protect yourself online, or more importantly, bypass country locks on sites like Netflix and YouTube, stick around until the end to hear all about it. The Autopsy of Jane Doe brings a whole new meaning to the term morbid curiosity. We follow the day in the life of a local multi-generational family morgue and crematory business operated by Tommy Tilden and his son Austin. But on this particular night, things are much different, as the local sheriff has the father and son examine the corpse of an unidentified woman who was found buried in the basement of a bizarre murder-suicide. Initially, nothing about it is entirely unusual, but it's not exactly a surprise when weird stuff begins to occur as the night goes on, as Tommy and Austin dig deeper into the increasingly distressing and unorthodox discoveries of Jane Doe's body. The first half is an incredibly engrossing plunge into the world of a coroner. Both Tommy and Austin are desensitized to death and feel no emotion towards the grisly corpses presented to them each passing week. The literal coldness of the setting extends to their very being, as it's implied through Austin's personal desire to escape such a macabre profession with his girlfriend Emma, that the Tilden family has a better relationship with the dead than they do with the living world. The atmosphere is probably its most striking storytelling device because you can interpret quite a lot from its subtlety. I love that it has this stylistic balance between modern science and traditionalism that ends up defining the story. The entire film takes place in Tommy's basement mortuary and becomes increasingly isolating and claustrophobic the longer you're there, to the point that you appreciate the few moments of levity in the outside world during the opening. Because once the autopsy begins, we're trapped in what symbolically feels more and more like a purgatory as the night progresses. Tommy and Austin are the deciders of fate. They determine the cause of death and help put the mysteries to rest. But while science correctly dominates the questions they ask themselves, it still doesn't stop Tommy and his son from embracing timeless superstitions, especially when they so evidently stare right back at you. So watching the Autopsy of Jane Doe, I could not help but be reminded of my conflicted relationship with the films of Scott Derrickson, notably Sinister, Deliver Us from Evil, and to a lesser extent, The Exorcism of Emily Rose. His horror films typically have these really unique genre flips where they employ contemporary drama conventions like a police procedural or an investigative mystery or a courtroom drama to help ground otherwise generic supernatural implications firmly in reality. The thing is, when they're focused on the drama, they work incredibly well, but when it comes time to indulge in the more overtly supernatural stuff, they tend to undermine the uniqueness of their setup by, well, just not being that good at it. The mystery shines brighter than the horror, but when the horror does take center stage, that is, it goes from believable real-world terrors to contrived spooky stuff, it completely overshadows the mystery. For example, Sinister has a phenomenal first half dealing with this strange murder conspiracy, but the second half turns into a silly haunted house movie. In Emily Rose, while it is more consistent with its courtroom ambiguity, the supernatural scenes are underwhelming in comparison. And finally, in Deliver Us from Evil, when it stops focusing on being a character study about skepticism, it kinda ends up ripping off most of Emily Rose's scares. Basically, with Derrickson's films, the spectacle of fantasy and realism feel mutually exclusive, and it clearly works so much better when the fantasy is implied through realistic scenes of human discovery and interaction, rather than generic abrasive scares, which is exactly what other films like The Last Exorcism, The Witch, and Lake Mungo do so incredibly well, because they do not pander to their audience. I think I've said this before, but it's like he's fearful that the audience can't be patient with dramatic material and needs to dilute the intelligence of his storytelling to give horror junkies something more flashy to feed on. But don't get me wrong, Derrickson isn't the only filmmaker guilty of this. I'm just picking him out because his films have so much more potential than what they are. My point is that the lack of cohesion I see in these types of films has become emblematic of most mainstream horror movies. Time and time again, you see directors feel a need to resort to formulaic tactics to, again, pander to the crowd because they're ultimately more committed to gaining a displaced popcorn scare rather than crafting the horror purely around the type of story it's telling. I feel like the Autopsy of Jane Doe falls into this disappointing pitfall of weakening its tone to force in dramatic escalation. But that's not to say it doesn't entirely work. I can accept good scares at the expense of story, but when your story is this strong, it's hard not to feel deflated by, and I hate to say this, predictable scares. Now, I won't be spoiling the second half just yet, but it is worth noting that it is a considerable departure from the engrossing brilliance of the first half. The initial setup surrounding the mysterious Jane Doe is left completely ambiguous, leaving a sinister notion at the back of your mind as Tommy and Austin examine further into the cause of death. At first, it's held together with remarkable scientific enquiry as they theorize about what happened to this Jane Doe, specifically regarding human trafficking, while strange and startling discoveries make them gradually doubt how worldly her death really is, eventually making the smart decision to just get the hell out of there. The real details lie in what we come to understand about her body and the contradictions that throw us off. For example, her body is limp but her eyes are clouded, which only happens several days after death, so why hasn't her body lapsed into rigor mortis? Her blackened lungs suggest third-degree burns, but there is no external signs or any indication she was an aggressive smoker. And how does her body still bleed profusely when her corpse is supposedly at least more than a few days old? It's the conflicting science that naturally transitions the story into the supernatural, and it slowly gets under your skin as Tommy and Austin eventually, well, get under her skin and unveil even more harrowing revelations. From this point on, it doesn't waste much time establishing that this isn't going to be a logical misunderstanding. It's not really hiding the fact that this is truly a supernatural scenario. However, what type of supernatural scenario? Well, that's where the line of inquiry moves to. The problem is that I feel it gives this away too early by using the handbook of horror cliches, like a radio playing eerie noises, a random fly emerging from her nose, and their cat somehow being fatally wounded that Tommy has to euthanize it. I never found any of the supernatural stuff to be all that inventive, and it's pretty much all the same criticisms I pointed out in the film's writer-director Andre Ovredel's other film, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Like, he's a great filmmaker, Trollhunter is amazing and undeniably his best work, but being the shameless hack that I am, I'm going to say that Jane Doe and Scary Stories is all style over substance when it comes to horror. In other words, the imagery is incredible, even provocative, but the execution of these scares is lackluster in comparison. Its true, undeniable strength comes from the relationship between Tommy and Austin because they bring real human weight to it, especially Brian Cox, who starts out as that intimidating Logan Roy authoritative father, but after his cat's death, he clearly shows a repressed grievance towards death. In this moment, it becomes apparent that he isn't as desensitized or stone cold as we thought he was, as it seems to make him reflect on the death of his wife, realizing, or rather accepting, that the only person left in his life is his son, who he knows is growing distant from him and intends on leaving the family business. It's the generational divide between them that wonderfully holds it together. One is stuck in his old ways, simply upholding loyalty to his family's tradition, while the other understandably doesn't want to feel burdened by tradition and live the life that he wants. Now, with that said, this is how I personally connected with the story, even if it isn't directly the film's intent to focus on it, because the way the film chooses to go about its conclusion completely shatters the progression of this interpretation. So let's enter spoiler territory. So I have very mixed feelings about the second half of the story, outside the whole spooky house of horror stuff that pads out the runtime. I do appreciate that the scares are left open to interpretation, like whether or not the morgue's other bodies reanimated or it was just in their heads, but these moments don't really do anything for me because, like I said earlier, it feels like they existed solely to be a Chekhov's gun to pander to the audience's expectation that they would eventually come into play. When it finally comes time to explaining who Jane Doe is and what happened to her, it basically uses the exact same plot device as The Conjuring. Jane Doe was a 17th century victim of the Salem witch trials, and was tortured and supposedly killed for allegedly being a witch. Now, I actually made a video on The Conjuring talking about this very issue, but I can't get the video online because it keeps getting blocked by Warner Brothers due to Content ID. However, here's the basic gist of my criticism that's actually going to be relevant in this video. I'm no expert on the witch trials, but using it as a gimmick for a witchcraft narrative can be borderline exploitative when you consider what the Salem witch trials historically represented. Rob Eggers' The Witch actually does this issue a lot of justice by using the broad landscape of New England witch hunts to explore both real extreme religious intolerance and the dangerous implications of using ignorance to brainwash people into an aggressively deformed mob mentality. Contextualizing the victims as villains for the sake of a plot twist is a harmful way to perpetuate mistruths. Like with Rob Eggers' film, you don't need the specific Salem trials to tell a story about witches, but Hollywood folk and mainstream films love to do it anyway because it's the most famous real-world example of it, and audiences can easily identify with it regardless of their ignorance. However, with that said, I do see where Jane Doe is attempting to go with this, and I would have respected it more if it wasn't for how it went about its final twist ending. So we learn that Jane Doe was viciously tortured and subjected to a ritual that condemned her for being a witch despite lacking any tangible proof. Instead, from my understanding, because there is no definitive answer, and I love that there isn't, the implication is that this holy ritual imposed on her did the reverse effect, and transformed this innocent victim into something sinister, as insinuated from the obscure demon that attacks Tommy and implants him with similar markings found under Jane Doe's skin. She now seeks perpetual vengeance for her treatment, so, in a way, her body is cursed to kill those who inadvertently get close to her, and after pleading with her body, because she is still conscious apparently, Tommy sacrifices himself to let her consume him and make him experience her unending pain in exchange for his son's life. I like it, it is genuinely interesting. I accept it as some ironic evil that condemns those responsible for her torture and continued fascination with her death, rather than just directly saying that she really was a witch. In fact, if my interpretation is anything to go by, she's more of a vessel for something otherworldly, given the cryptic symbols under her skin. However, where things go wrong for me is when Austin is tricked into thinking it's all over and falls to his death after hallucinating his father's corpse, leaving the morgue to mirror the same murder-suicide scene from where the body was found, confirming she was malevolent this entire time. I know this isn't technically fair on the film because it's what I want, but I think this bleak attempt at shock value undermines the father-son character arc. The idea of the father sacrificing himself for his son is a powerful concept that ties into Austin wanting to leave the family business. Tommy has accepted his son deserves to escape this life, and so symbolically ends the business's bloodline. But it's then let down by this really mean-spirited treatment of Austin and his girlfriend Emma. So earlier in the film, Tommy and Austin are tricked into thinking they're being attacked by a corpse, but predictably it turns out to be Emma, yet it's too late and Tommy accidentally kills her with an axe. It's simply cheap and unnecessary, and it's later compounded by crushing any hope of Austin escaping when he falls to his death, symbolically giving us the reverse payoff of trapping him forever within the morgue. Here's the thing, in some respects I can accept a nihilistic scenario, but I think I've also started to outgrow these types of endings when the story doesn't do anything thematic with it other than looking to provoke you. The ending of Jane Doe left me more angry than empty. It takes a compelling look at our relationship with the macabre and cynically digs down rather than up. At the end of the day, I can appreciate it as deliberately polarizing, and I do still highly recommend it for its positive qualities, considering the horror scenes are a whole other level of subjectivity that will naturally work differently for other people. So make sure to let me know your thoughts on the autopsy of Jane Doe in the comments below. And just before we end, I want to give a shout out to this video's sponsor, ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN relieves you of the stress of being preyed upon by snoopers, hackers, or simply anyone tracking your online activity. A virtual private network masks your IP address and encrypts your data while you're online, so you can protect your sensitive information while online shopping, checking your bank accounts, or accessing websites that seem suspect or dubious. However, let's cut to the chase. You want a VPN to access films that are locked outside your country on platforms such as YouTube, Netflix, Prime, and even Disney+. ExpressVPN lets you do that by allowing you to reroute your connection to a server location of your choice. For example, one of the movies I referenced in this video was Deliver Us from Evil, a film I highly recommend, especially if you like my topics involving Sean Harris, but at the time of recording, it's not available on the US Netflix server, but it is currently available on the UK one, so by downloading the app for your phone, tablet, computer, or whatever device you like to use, you simply select a country of your choosing, click connect, and now you can enjoy watching Sean Harris once again be all weird and creepy. ExpressVPN is less than $7 a month with a 30-day money-back guarantee, so why not give it a spin and find out how you can get 3 months free by visiting expressvpn.com/Ryan, and until next time, stay safe and I'll see you all very soon. Bye.